So we're here going to talk about brokerage relationships. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is that there's two things going on. All right? There's the job of real estate, which is listing property, selling property, writing contracts, right? That's the job. And we're all going to do the job. That's what we do. We do the job of real estate. And then there's how we represent our buyers and sellers. The relationship we have with the buyers and sellers. And that's called brokerage relationships. So one has nothing to do with the other. There's the job of real estate, which includes getting paid, by the way. So you're going to get paid, and then you're going to have a relationship with your customer. Now, since this is kind of a closed group, and it's our company, our brokerage relationship in the company is that we act as transaction brokers. There's three choices. There's single agent, transaction broker, and no brokerage relationship, which I'll tell you when we're going to use that. But for the most part, we are transaction brokers. So most of what I say today is going to be tailored towards our policy of being a transaction broker. Okay? So, what is it? This is a disclosure law. It was designed to be a consumer protection law that required us to disclose who we represent, so the customer should know what to say and what not to say to us. So for instance, if I was representing the seller, should the buyer tell me any confidential information? Well, the answer is no, because I'd go ahead and tell the seller. But the buyer should have a right to know that. And that's what this was to protect. So we're going to proceed with the way the law is today. I'm not going to get into the history. And what we should be doing today. Now, since we're a transaction broker state, because the law says we're presumed to be transaction brokers, unless we establish a different relationship in writing, we don't have a disclosure as a transaction broker. I don't totally agree with that, and you all know that. I don't agree with that. I still think we should disclose. You see, until I see this sign on I-95,
I like it.
welcome to Florida, we're all transaction brokers. Unless we start seeing that, which tells everybody when they cross the border from Georgia that we are a transaction broker state, they're not going to know. And as long as they don't know, I think it's our responsibility to let them know. Because a lot of these customers are coming from states where they're agency states. So they're used to sales associates being their agent, which have completely different duties than what we do. So until we see this, I'm going to still require in my company that we disclose that we're transaction brokers. Okay? And you're going to see that disclosure in the handout.
It'd be a nice little thing to have, like when you go to a presentation.
Yeah,
When you're just have that.
I'll send you that.
Or make a keychain with that on it.
A keychain?
A keychain, yeah.
You want me to make a
Make
keychain?
keychains with that on it.
It lights up
Why
and
not?
sings.
Lights up and sings. Okay.
Any
I like
other
it.
requests?
Yeah.
I like it.
Oh, nice. That would be nice.
something I did.
It's the only thing.
Why don't we function at one level, one capacity, statewide? Why can't we? Why isn't it law?
The state sets the law, and this is what the law is. So why can't they allow you to go through red lights? It's the law. They set the law, and we follow the law. So there are some states that have outlawed agency, and you cannot be an agent. Florida gives it to you as an option. So, you know, I've kind of stayed with this and studied this since 1993, and I don't want to get into the history of it, but I thought that it would be a good idea to understand how people express themselves, how they talk. But I want you to take a look at this. I want you to take a look at this, and I want you to read it and accent a different word. So I'll read it first. I didn't say she was drunk yesterday. All right? So Anthony, read it and accent a different word.
I didn't say that she was drunk yesterday.
Now that has a completely different meaning, doesn't it? In fact, if you read this statement and emphasize a different word, it will in fact mean something entirely different. So how important is it, not just what we say, but how we say it? And that's why we need to understand brokerage relationships, because we need to watch what we say, because it can be misinterpreted, and if it gets misinterpreted, then we could create what's called an unintended agency, and this unintentional agency could get us in trouble. That's why in my company we ban the word agent. I never ever want you to say the word agent, listing agent, any of those things that client, any of those words that might indicate an agency relationship, because we don't do that. And I don't want to have the customer misunderstand what we do. I'm not sure this is going to
Wouldn't
play
that
out.
kind of confuse the customer though?
So it takes a little change, right? Takes a little change. Yeah, Elizabeth, go ahead.
Oh, I was asking, wouldn't that really confuse your potential customer, because they think, well, yeah, you're showing me homes and properties. So if I ask you, do you think this needs to be replaced?
Right,
You can't tell them,
Right.
because that's an opinion.
right.
Um,
So what does it mean? Give me an idea. Tell me what
Well,
you're talking
I'm
about.
just thinking, because people think you're almost like their little confidant, their little BFF, and
Yes.
you're really like, yeah, I can't, I'm just showing you houses. You kind of have to
Right.
stay a little
So-
further away, but I think it's kind of like a fine line, because yeah, you want to guide them through the process.
Give me an example, specific.
Okay.
You
So
want me
if
to
you're
change
selling a
something?
home and they decide on a price, and then they turn around and ask you, what do you think?
Everybody will do it.
Yeah.
Everybody will ask you, what do you think?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what do I think about the price? Well, now there's two things we have to think about. One, is this a customer, and are we showing an in-house sale? If this is an in-house sale, right, we can't talk about the price. We only can defend the listed price, because we are a transaction broker to both parties. So if this is a in-house sale, then I have to represent that $200,000. So now the customer says, well, you know, what do you think about the price? Well, let me show you a list of solds that are comparable, and you'll see the pricing that, you know, you should make an offer on. See, my opinion doesn't matter. And that's something everybody has to accept. My opinion doesn't matter. And when customers are asking your opinion, they're not really asking for your opinion. They're asking you to verify that they're not making a mistake. You know, what do you think about this? Well, you know, if you're asking me, if I'm showing two-story houses, and they say, you know, this is a really nice house, what do you think of this? I'm going to say, I'll never buy a two-story house because I'll never go up and down the stairs. Do they really want my opinion? No, they want my opinion. They want me to make sure or verify that they're not making a mistake. And that's what it's all about. So they don't really want your opinion, but give them facts. See, a transaction broker gives facts, figures, and information. Give them facts, figures, and information. Well, are you asking me about the price? Yes. Well, since I'm a transaction broker with the seller, and he's listed it at $200,000, I can show you comparable sales that have occurred that are just like this home here. And then, if you want to make an offer, you can formulate it from that list. Right? Now, why can't I give my opinion about that? Because I have to defend the listed price. Now, doesn't that tip you off a little bit that you should not take an overpriced listing? Because if you take an overpriced listing, you're in trouble. You can't do a CMA. Because if you do a CMA and it doesn't support the listed price, then you're in trouble. You violated the law. But if you're a transaction broker only on one side, if you're a transaction broker to only the buyer, and it's an outhouse sale, does everybody know what I mean when it's an outhouse sale?
No.
It's not one of our listings,
Oh, okay.
all right? Not selling bathrooms.
I was thinking of an outhouse.
All right? When it's an outhouse sale, if it's an in-house sale, we might not be able to do a CMA. If we do a CMA and it defends the listed price, then that's okay. But it might not. In that case, we give them a list of solds. But if it's an outhouse sale and we don't represent that seller, and he says, well, what do you think? You'll say, let me do a CMA and you show you what the number should be. And you'll give him a range of values where it should sell, and that's where you start with your offer. But that's why we can't take an overpriced listing, because it puts you in danger of violating the law. Because if you went ahead and said, well, this is overpriced and I think it should be about $50,000 less, you just violated the law because you were supposed to defend that listed price. So that's why you should never take an overpriced listing, so that you can defend it with a CMA. But if you suspect your CMA is not going to defend it, the best you can do is run a list of solds, because that's of record information. And you can use of record information. You just can't give your opinion about it or your analysis about it. Okay? So that's where you stand with that.
What determines overpriced?
That's a really good question.
Well,
It's a very good question.
somebody pays for something and they want to realize that back,
Yeah.
commission property. So
Right.
what's- yeah.
Well, when we say overpriced, we're talking about the market, not what the person paid.
Okay.
What the person paid has got nothing to do with it.
No, it's the market.
It's the market. So what does the market bear? Now, in today's market, where we're talking crazy numbers, people listing things and people buying things at crazy numbers, that's a really good question. What is overpriced? You know, some of the things that I'm looking at and saying, that's way overpriced. People have multiple offers and they're eating it up and buying it like crazy. So what is overpriced? See, we used to say 5 to 10% over what your range was is pretty much where you have to go. Today, when there's nothing like it on the market and there's nothing there, who knows what's overpriced? But the point is, you have to defend that number, whatever it is. So if you chose to put the number real high, you're gonna have to defend that number somehow,
But
right?
sometimes with an RPR, you can change
Mm-hmm.
what the price is. Like, there's actually a point in there where you can change it for, like now the market is a little bit high and crazy. You can put a percentage of there of what you thought the basic price might be to that value. And then let's say they got a new refrigerator, they got new floors, they got whatever.
Yeah,
And when they bought it, you can add that to it in a way that it comes out and gives you a different
yeah.
estimate.
I mean, you can't get a false value,
Yeah, right.
but you can make adjustments. RPR is gonna pick up things that is of record information. So that means that if they pulled a permit for something, it's gonna pick up the improvement. But if it wasn't permitted, if it was something that they needed in the house, that they did, but there was no permit for it, it's not gonna show that. And that's where you can make your adjustment, okay? All right, so what is a transaction broker? In the law, there are certain definitions, and that's what we're gonna look at. These are things defined in the law. So a transaction broker is a broker who provides limited representation to the buyer or the seller, or both, in a real estate transaction, but does not represent either party in a fiduciary capacity. Now, what is the fiduciary? Fiduciary is that trust and confidence relationship built in an agency. So where transaction brokerage is considered a non-agency, okay? So we represent the buyer and the seller, but not necessarily in a fiduciary capacity, okay? It's going to be as a transaction broker. That's what it's called, transaction broker, okay? Now, transaction brokers provide facts, figures, information, where an agent might provide advice and opinions. So once you start leaning to the dark side and give your opinions and advice, you're going to create an unintended agency. And now the customer has a right to believe that you're an agent and expect fiduciary duties, and you're not going to provide those. So you have to be very careful not to present yourself in a different manner than transaction broker. You got to learn how to act like a transaction broker and speak like a transaction broker. You can't act like an agent and speak like an agent and call yourself a transaction broker. So we have to learn the differences. So what's a customer? A customer is defined in the law as anyone that has any interest in buying or selling real estate in a real estate transaction. So we're talking about potential buyers and sellers are going to be considered customers. Now remember that we are presumed to be transaction brokers. So everybody we meet, even if you're going to be an agent, when you first meet them, you're a transaction broker and they're a customer. Until you establish a different relationship in writing, which means you got to get involved in a contract, and now you're an agent, and that's changed. They're no longer customers. But initially, everybody's a customer. Right? Initially, everybody's a customer. Transaction broker has customers where an agent has what's called a principal. And we're going to give you the definition of a principal in a minute because they're in a single agency relationship. Single agent is a broker who acts as a fiduciary to either the buyer or the seller, but not both in the same transaction. That's dual agency and that's illegal. Now, a single agent is hired by the principal. the principal in our case, either it would be the seller or the buyer in the transaction. So they're called a principal. They're not called a client. The law does not have a definition of the word client in it. It only has the definition of the word principal in it. So even if the person is claiming to be an agent, they shouldn't be calling that buyer or seller a client. Because in our law, they've defined that person as a principal. So the way I look at it is, if it's not defined in the law, I'm not going to use the word. So that's another word we don't say in this office. We don't say client. Never, ever, ever. It's a customer. Okay? It's always a customer. So, since the law says that we have to disclose to all parties who are not represented in a residential transaction, they had to define a residential transaction in the law. So the law provides for the definition of residential as 4 units or less, so 4 houses or less, land that could be used for 4 units or less, and agricultural land that is 10 acres or less. So, if it falls in that definition, then we have to do these disclosures. Okay? So now the disclosure itself. If you notice the law, it says, disclose to all parties who are not represented in a residential transaction. So, that means if the person is represented, then we don't have to do the disclosure. So, when you first meet your seller to do a listing, they're not represented. So you have to do a disclosure. When you first meet your buyer, they're not represented. So you have to do a disclosure. Okay? Now, there are forms, and you're going to see the forms in your outline. Interesting thing about the forms, they were written up with signature lines, but there's nothing in the law says that they had to be signed. There's no requirement for them to be signed. There's only 2 forms that have to be signed, and single agent isn't one of them, and no brokerage relationship isn't one of them. Okay, so we have to give this disclosure to parties who are not represented. So if we know somebody's represented, so you're at an open house and somebody walks in, a customer walks in with another sales associate, and that sales associate is a transaction broker with that buyer, well, they're represented. We don't have to do a disclosure. So all parties who are not represented, okay? So there are exceptions, and we're going to talk about them. Disclosure timing, well, if you notice, it says in the outline for a single agent and no brokerage relationship. You see that? Because there is no disclosure for transaction broker, is there? I require it, but the law doesn't require it. So, before showing properties or before entering into an agreement, you have to do this disclosure. So I suggest on the first meeting with your buyer, when you sit them down in the office and you talk to them and do your buyer interview, you give them that transaction broker form. When you go to your listing appointment, you sit down with the seller, the very first thing you do is you tell them that you work as a transaction broker, and you get that form out of the way. And the way you do the form is you ask them to sign a copy, which you take back, and you give them an unsigned copy for themselves. Okay? So that's how that form is done. Now the exceptions, as I told you earlier, whenever they make a law, there's always exceptions to the law. So here's your exceptions. And again, the first one, rentals, it's not a sale. As long as they don't mention option to buy or lease option where there's a sale, you don't have to do it for rentals. Business brokerage, okay, where they're buying and selling businesses. Open house and model homes. Now, again, there's an exception to the law. I want you to ignore that exception. So if you're doing an open house or you're sitting model homes, I want you to provide the notice. So here's my sign-in sheet, and if you don't mind, can you just sign this no brokerage relationship form? So when you do your open houses, that'll be part of your routine. So when the customer comes in and signs the open house sheet, they sign the no brokerage relationship form.
On the FISBO as well?
Say it again.
On the FISBO as well?
Yes, when we get to the, yeah. I want you to do it with FISBOs too when you meet the FISBO for the very first time. Unanticipated encounters, this is when you visit people in Publix and you see them and they see your badge and they say, you're in real estate, what's the market like, et cetera, et cetera. You don't have to do any disclosures there. And then when you discuss your resume, so if they ask you how many listings do you have or whatever the situation might be, then you don't have to do any disclosure there, okay? When they become a real customer, when you'll know, a little light will go on in your brain and say, hey, you know what? I think I may have something here. These people are talking serious. This might come to something. When that happens, you probably shared some confidential information. When you share confidential information or you enter into an agreement, you have to do the disclosure, okay? So those are requirements. So let's get through the duties. Let's jump right to the duties. And I'm going to zip through the agency duties because I don't want you to be an agent. And pretty much we have no exception to this rule, okay? I sold my father's house. I was a transaction broker. So pretty much there's no exception. We're not going to be an agent, right? So here's the list of duties: dealing honestly and fairly, and that one is in all of the duties. So if you're going, all of the relationships, if you're going to be a single agent, if you're going to be a transaction broker, if you're going to be no brokerage relationship, you got to act and deal honestly and fairly. Okay. Loyalty. Now, loyalty is a fiduciary, right? Loyalty means you have to get the best price, the best terms. You can't have anybody else's interest except that principal's. So loyalty is a fiduciary. Confidentiality, that's a strong fiduciary because that never dies. You could have a listing as a single agent and the listing may expire. And then after the expiration, you still have confidentiality. You can never ever use anything, any information that you've learned to harm that principal, even after the contract's over. So that's a strong one. Obedience, another fiduciary. You have to obey all lawful requests. Full disclosure, any information, whether it's factual, whether it's a rumor, it doesn't matter. Any information regarding the transaction of the property, you've got to bring it to the principal. Accounting for funds. So if you're entrusted with funds, you've got to deliver them properly. The broker has to deliver it. And if it goes to closing, it has to be brought to closing in a timely manner. the skill, care, and diligence in a transaction. Well, a skill, care, and diligence basically means you have to do your job properly. You got to attend training so you understand what the law requires. You have to be able to do, the job correctly. So, skill, care, and diligence, and by the way, you have to do that because you're licensed. Not necessarily because it's a requirement in a disclosure law, but because you're licensed, you have to perform your duties with skill, care, and diligence. All right? And then presenting all offers and counteroffers in a timely manner. Basically, that is to prevent sales associates from grabbing it, putting it in a drawer, forgetting it, and then shopping it around to see if they can get something better. Now, that's not the worst thing in the world to shop around and get something better. But you have to have told the seller about the one you threw in the drawer, right? You got to tell them about it first. Okay? And then disclose all known facts all known facts that materially affect the value of the residential property, which is not readily observable. So if you have a big hole in the wall, and they come in and they see the hole in the wall, I don't have to disclose it. But if there's a big hole in the wall and there's a picture over the big hole in the wall, then I have to tell them there's a big hole in the wall. So if the roof leaks, I have to tell them that the roof leaks. Okay? So anything that's a material fact has to be disclosed. And that is also in all three relationships. That's a court case. So that's something that has to be taken care of. It's Johnson v. Davis. Everybody knows that one.
And this is the dining room. Oh, that's a lovely size room. Yes, they are big in these houses. Most of them have been converted into flats, so to get one like this, a bit of a lucky line. How many bedrooms is it? It's 2, but there is the box room, which could be an office, or could be used as a third bedroom. I think we definitely need 3 double bedrooms. You got box, you. You got box, you.
See if I can get it on the speaker.
Well, it's not the biggest one I've seen, but they have made great use of the space. The fridge is set into the wall.
Oh, that's nice.
And there's a fully electric hob.
I really don't like the electric. You can't gauge the heat properly.
Did I ask you? Did I ask you? Look at me. Look at me in the eye. Did I ask you? Don't vex me, yeah?
And you can probably negotiate the washing. Shall we pop upstairs? So, that was the house. Any more questions?
I don't think so, Wally.
Well, I do have another couple come and see it this afternoon. Second viewing, so...
I don't really like it, but it's his house.
Look, I know this is the most expensive purchase you're ever going to make. I understand that. So if you and Robbie need a little more time to mull it over, you let me know.
Well, to be honest, it's a little bit out of our price range.
Did I ask you? Did I ask you? No. Buy this house.
I can't afford
Buy it.
I have to take it to the bank.
Buy it.
Please don't.
Buy it.
Please don't.
Buy it.
Look, I beg you.
Buy it.
Stop it.
Buy it.
You can't do this.
Buy it.
Really, I'm...
Buy it.
Please.
Buy it.
I won't do it.
Buy it.
Okay. Please.
Let's get back to my office and sign the paperwork. Ooh, I am having a busy day.
Hopefully, not all single agents are like that, but I always like that video. All right, so now if you are a single agent, how do you show your own properties? Well, since you can't show your own properties, that's dual agency, they have to transition a transaction broker anyway. So the only way they can show their own properties is if they're a transaction broker. So they'll have to sign this consent to transition a transaction broker, and it's typically done at the listing appointment, it's typically done when you first meet your buyer. But this form has to be signed, because this form is giving you permission to go from an agent to a transaction broker, okay? So that's one thing, again, that we don't have to do. So let's talk transaction broker. Now, transaction broker, as I mentioned earlier, represents the buyer or the seller, or even both in the same transaction in an in-house sale, okay? Now, when they do, as described earlier, when they do, there are certain rules that they have to follow. You're going to learn those rules in a transaction broker, transaction broker relationship. So let's go through the duties in your outline there. Dealing honestly and fairly, accounting for funds, using skill, care, diligence. These are all what we discussed. Disclosing all known facts that materially affect the value of the real estate, and then presenting all offers and counteroffers in a timely manner. We talked about that. Here's the kicker. Here's the difference. This one is what makes transaction brokerage. You have to have limited confidentiality unless waived in writing. Now, that's a very important statement. Limited confidentiality unless waived in writing. And we're going to demonstrate that. And it has to do with three things: the price, the terms, and the motivations behind the sale. The price, the terms, and the motivations behind the sale. So let's talk the price. We talked about it a little bit. Let's talk about it some more. The price. So the price is $250,000, and the seller said, you know, I'll go ahead and take $200,000, but you know, let's put it at $250,000. Well, so now the buyer says, gee, you know, this house, $250,000. I'll go as high as $225,000, but I don't think. I'll make an offer at $200,000. So now in your head, you're saying, hey, you know, this guy's got, you know, got a deal here. But can you say anything to the buyer? No. You have to defend $250,000. So now you bring that offer to the seller and you say, okay, Mr. Seller, here's the $200,000. $200,000, well, that sounds pretty good. Now you know the buyer would take $200,000, right? The buyer just made that offer. You know the seller will accept $200,000.
Why don't you just list it that price to begin with?
Yeah, good question. Why didn't you list it at that in the first place?
You don't always get listed.
Right. But here's the thing. Can the seller now say, well, you know, if he's willing to do $200,000, can I go higher? And he can, right? He can. So you can't divulge anything. I can't say, well, you know, the seller told me he'd take $200,000, so let's go ahead and make that offer. I can't do that. I have to defend $250,000, right? So regardless of whether you know or not, and let me tell you something. You know, don't listen to the sellers. If the seller says, I'll take $200,000, you don't know that the night before something happened and they might even have to take it off the market, much less accept $200,000. Or maybe they'll say, you know, they're going to call you the next day and say, I need to raise the price. You don't know. So when somebody says, the seller told me he'd do this, don't believe it. Don't believe it. It only happens when it happens. So if there's an offer and it's brought to the seller, that's what we're going to discuss. I'm not going to discuss anything that was said before, okay? So that's the price. The terms. Let's say the property is listed and the buyer comes and looks at it and he says, you know, I really like this house, but I went to the mortgage broker and he said I can get an 80% loan and I have 10% in cash, but I'm going to be short 10%. So in my head, the first thing I'm thinking is that, well, if I can get the owner to hold 10% purchase money mortgage, we might be able to make a deal here. But I cannot do that. Anybody tell me why? Yep.
You can't disclose his financial business unless he gives you permission.
Right. And the permission would have been when he took the listing, he checked the box that said owner financing. But since that box was not checked, you can't discuss that. So now what you have to do is you have to ask permission of the buyer to share that financial information with the seller. And he'll say, yeah, you can do that. You know, I think I may have a solution to this problem. Would you allow me to discuss that information with the seller? Yeah, I get it in writing. Because you see what the law says, unless waived in writing. So I get it in writing and I bring it over to the seller and I say, listen, I've got permission to discuss the buyer's financial information. He's got a problem. He's going to need 10% purchase money mortgage from you. And I know you didn't discuss it, you didn't want to do that, but let me explain to you what it means. Because if you allow it, we might be able to generate an offer, we might be able to sell your home. So you discuss it with him and you show him how it's done, and he says, okay, for this customer only, let's offer him that. So you go ahead and get that in writing, that he's allowing the purchase money mortgage. And then you go back to the buyer and you say, okay, I think we have a solution. 80% loan, 10% cash, 10% purchase money mortgage. Why don't we write it up, put it in an offer, and then bring it to the seller? So it wasn't on the table, but I got it on the table. And I got it in writing that I was allowed to discuss it. That's called the financial terms. Now the last thing that we have to be careful about, we can't disclose, is the motivations behind the sale. So Elizabeth, they're going to ask you this question too. Why is the seller selling? Every buyer wants to know why they're selling. They think it's going to give them an edge in negotiations, and it might. Why is the seller selling? Well, you can't tell them. You can't give them an edge in the negotiations. The law says that you can't act to the detriment of one party. When acting as a transaction broker to both parties, so therefore you can't divulge that information. So what do? I'm going to tell you, don't find out in the first place. If Belkis takes a listing and she finds out that they're getting a divorce, the only one who should know that information is Belkis and Honora. When she tells everybody in the office about the listing, she should tell them about the house, not the people. So she's going to tell you it's a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, fireplace, pool. She's not saying anything about the motivations. So that now, when that customer goes up to Elizabeth and says, why are they selling, what can she say?
I don't know.
I don't know. But here, if Belkis announced it at a meeting, and Elizabeth knows and that customer says, why are they selling?
It's none of my business.
You can't say, I don't know.
But I can say it's none of my business.
No, because you know. Remember, one of the very first thing is you have to be honest. That's
Well,
not
I
honest.
know, but it's not really my information to disclose.
Yeah, and she's gonna say, yeah, because you have to be honest. So if you don't know, you can't say.
That's
So keep all that personal information to yourself. Only talk about the house. Okay? Now, what happens if you do know? You're gonna have to say, well, you know what? As a transaction broker, I can't talk about price, terms, and motivations behind the sale. So just as I can't tell the seller why you need to buy the home, I can't tell you why the seller needs to sell the home.
Even
And
if
that's the importance of discussing this the first meeting. Yeah,
even if it's a positive reason?
yeah. Unless you got it in writing that you could.
Okay.
Remember, unless waived in writing. If you got it waived in writing, then you can. If you did not, then you can't. So we have to be careful. And most likely, maybe Belka's got it in writing, but probably didn't share it with you. And you would have had to have known that it's in the file that you were allowed to say this. See? So we have to be careful with that. So we can't act to the detriment of one party over the other party when acting as a transaction broker to both parties. And again, let's talk about being a transaction broker just to the buyer. It's not your listing. And the only way this buyer can buy it is with purchase money mortgage. And the MLS sheet says no purchase money mortgage. Can you write up the offer with the purchase money mortgage?
No.
What do you think?
Well, you have to present all offers.
Yes? So can you write it?
You can always write it.
There you go. See, I don't represent him. So I can write the offer any way the buyer needs it to be written, as long as I don't represent that seller. So then I'm going to bring it to the seller, and the rep is going to say, hey, didn't you see in the multiple listing service that, no purchase money mortgages? And you're going to say, yes, I did. That's the only way my buyer could actually buy the property. Oh, and by the way, you also had $250,000 in the MLS, and this offer is for $190,000. Can you write an offer for less than what's in the multiple listing?
Sure. It's an offer.
It's an offer, so it doesn't matter what's in there, does it? It's whatever the buyer wants to buy that property at is what I'm talking about, okay? So we have to be careful, price, terms, motivation of the sale, only when it's an in-house sale. As I mentioned, if it's an outhouse sale, we don't necessarily have to worry about that, do we?
Okay, question then.
Yep, go ahead.
Belkis has a listing.
Uh-huh.
I want to show her listing. Should I review the file and know as much as I can about that
Absolutely.
property, but don't know everything? Or
No, absolutely you should review the file and see everything.
then I know that the wife is getting divorced.
No, that's not in the file.
Oh, it's on the file.
Why would that be in the
I
file?
don't know.
Well,
I hope that's not in the file.
There's no reason for you to go look at the listing file. Everything you need to know is on that
On
MLS.
MLS.
Okay, great.
But there's nothing that preventing you from doing it either.
No, but it's not.
But what you see in that file, even if it said the motivations, even if somewhere in there it said they're getting divorced, you know you can't tell them that. It just puts you in a bad position. And that's why I'm saying to you, don't know it. And Honora's right. Everything you need about that property is in the multiple listing service. In fact, I'll go one step back. One step back. As a professional sales associate, what do you need? And there's only two pieces of information. What do you need to sell that property? Two things.
Price.
Anybody want to guess? Price?
Price and
Location.
address.
Price and address. Tell me where it is. Tell me how much they want. And I can figure out the rest. I can walk through and see it as a fireplace. I can see it as wood cabinets. I can see if I had to. What the MLS is supposed to do is to help you to help the buyer, so that you don't have to do a whole bunch of research, right? That's what it's there to do. It's not to tell you about the personal things. And if you see personal things in a multiple listing, that person did something wrong. Because that should not be in a multiple listing. A divorce or any personal information. That shouldn't be in there. Okay?
What about when the people put on the listing, sellers motivated?
Yeah, if they're not motivated, it shouldn't be in the multiple listing. Right? I mean, if they're not motivated to sell, why is it in the multiple listing? Right?
Well, it's amazing how many people list their homes and you're, oh, I'm surprised it sold so quickly. I'm like, what do you expect's gonna happen? You put your house on the
Should be
market
happy.
and someone wants to buy it. Oh my God, you're surprised.
It should be happy.
Yeah, I was like, plan ahead then. If you know you're gonna list your house, you better have.
Should be
a place to
happy.
move.
What they're really saying is, oh, I've got to pack and move now.
Well, no, that's
No,
not.
they're saying, oh, I should ask for more.
It's called reality.
Yeah.
No,
That's what it
they
is.
said they haven't even started packing, oh, I have so many days,
Yeah,
whatever.
it's called
Well,
reality.
they're just not gonna satisfy that, so.
All right, where are we? Overpriced.
We left off at transaction brokerage. And now we're going to talk about no brokerage relationship. Now, the law provides that the customer may not want to be represented. See, if they're a single agent, they represent the buyer and seller in a fiduciary capacity. If they're a transaction broker, they represent the buyer and seller, or maybe both in the same transaction, with limited confidentiality. But the law accepts that maybe the buyers and sellers don't want representation. Maybe they just want the job done and they don't want to have a relationship. So they came up with what they call no brokerage relationship. Oops. The no brokerage relationship. Now this is kind of a hard thing to sell to a customer. Try selling somebody something with the word no in it. It's kind of hard.
Well, for sale by owner, they don't want to pay you, so they may like.
Pretty
Sounds
much they've
good.
chosen not to be represented.
Yeah.
So when we, in our company, work with a for sale by owner, we're going to give them a no brokerage relationship. They didn't want to be represented, we're not going to represent them. So typically what would happen is if you see a for sale by owner and your buyer may be interested in buying that, you've already got a transaction broker relationship going with your buyer, you're going to knock on the door of the for sale by owner, arrange to get a one-time listing agreement, and that's in your form simplicity, and you're going to present them the no brokerage relationship form of that contract. Now, for another conversation is you should have already agreed to be paid by the buyer in a buyer-broker agreement. But at any rate, you're going to provide that seller, that for sale by owner, the no brokerage relationship form. In the no brokerage relationship, there's 3 basic duties. It's really what I call down and dirty real estate. There's just 3 duties, all right? And they are dealing honestly and fairly, disclosing all known facts that materially affect the value of the residential real estate, which is not readily observable, and to account for funds. 3 main duties, that's all you have to do. But I don't want you to think that, wow, that, just 3 things. Well, you still have to do skill, care, and diligence, right? You're licensed. You're not getting away with that. And FREC is still going to want you to present offers and counteroffers in a timely manner, because they're going to say, well, that's just skill, care, and diligence. You need to do that. So there are some things you're going to need to do because you're licensed. But in terms of the relationship, those are the only 3 things you have to do. So with a for sale by owner, you're going to want to do that. The other thing you're going to do, okay, in an open house. Now, I know it specifically said you have an exception. You don't have to do a disclosure, but I require it. When you're doing an open house, here's the sign-in sheet. By the way, here's the no brokerage relationship form, okay? And here's why. The law is pretty clear you have an exception. But as soon as you start to share confidential information, you have to give them a disclosure. So let's say you have this person come in your open house and you're showing them the house. And let's take, for example, it's Capri Court, which is a 2-story home. And now you're upstairs in the kitchen and they say, you know what, this is a really nice view. This is beautiful. We can arrange financing for this. We have about $40,000 we could put towards it, and we could get the financing for the rest. They're sharing confidential information with you. And as soon as that happens, you're going to have to disclose who you work for. So you're going to disclose no brokerage relationship, saying that I don't represent you. And maybe they won't want to share that information with you. Okay? So that's why I require you to do it up front. Because let's take an example if you didn't. So you didn't give them the no brokerage. You're up in the kitchen. They share confidential information. You don't have the form. So you don't do anything. Now, if you don't do anything, by law, what are you? What's your relationship?
Transaction broker.
Transaction broker. Because the law says you're a transaction broker unless you establish a different relationship in writing. Well, you didn't, so you're a transaction broker. Now, remember the duties as a transaction broker on both sides. You can't talk about price, terms, and motivations behind the sale. So that means that all that financial information they just shared with you, you can't share that with the seller. Right? Now, you've been working with this seller for a long time. Wouldn't you want to give them an edge? Here's this guy just walked in off the street. Now I got to treat him equally. So the requirement for us in this company is to give them that no brokerage relationship form up front so that we don't fall into that danger of being a transaction broker both sides. Okay? Now there's one other way that we end up being no brokerage relationship, and this one's a little complicated if I haven't made it complicated enough for you. There's such a thing as a limited listing agreement. It's a limited service agreement. You might have come across one or two of these, where the seller just wants you to put it in the multiple listing service. They're just going to pay you a fee, just put it in the multiple listing service. I don't want you to negotiate on my behalf. I don't want you to advertise it. I don't even want you to show it. I don't want you to arrange appointments. All I want you to do is to put it in a multiple listing service, and I'll take care of the rest. So if that buyer wants to buy it, that sales associate's going to present me the offer as the seller. Okay? Limited service. Now typically what they'll do is that broker will charge them a fee. And he'll take that fee and put it right in his pocket. He's done. His job's done. The only thing he has to guarantee is to pay a commission to the cooperative agent coming in, right, which is part of the agreement. So,
How does he coordinate that part?
the
Oh, 'cause he did.
seller's going to say, I sold it, going to closing on this date. Then that broker writes the title company, tells them who to pay and what. Okay? All right. So what do we have to do? Well, if we want to show that house in the multiple listing service, we got to contact that seller. You're going to call that seller on the phone. Got an offer, I got a buyer may be interested in buying your home, I'd like to show it tomorrow. Sure, come by. I'll be home. You knock on the door. They open the door. Are they represented? Nope.
No.
No. What does the law say? I must disclose to all parties who are not represented. They're not represented. So I have to give them a disclosure. What disclosure am I going to give them?
No brokerage.
No brokerage relationship.
Oh,
Okay? They didn't want any representation,
That would make sense.
and I represent my buyer as a transaction broker. So I am now going to be no brokerage with that seller, just as if it was a for sale by owner. So in our company, there's only 3 times that we would use no brokerage relationship. During the open house situation, for sale by owner, or in a limited capacity or a limited listing agreement.
Question.
Yeah.
In a for sale by owner, where the seller pays the commission,
Mhm.
so the house is selling for $250,000, that's what the seller is expecting to achieve. Is then the commission added on top of that, or is it taken out of the $250,000?
It could be. Could be. If the seller says to you, I need to net $250,000, then you got to figure out what they can sell it for. That's called a net. So typically it's not. Typically it's, I need to sell it for this so that I can net this. And they'll subtract all the fees. Right?
So it is added on to the
All right, so that is the 3 that we have in residential. Single agency, transaction brokerage, no brokerage relationship. Now there's only one that is what we call, it's for non-residential properties. So typically it's for commercial properties. And that is called a designated sales associate role. Now this was established primarily for commercial people because commercial people were telling FREC, listen, we always work as a single agent for the buyer and we always work as a single agent for the seller. Now we would call that dual agency, and dual agency was illegal as of 1997. So they came up with designated sales associate for these purposes. So a couple of things have to happen. Number 1, this form that we present must be signed, and the form states that the customers, both of them, buyers and sellers, each have assets of $2 million or more, or, I'm sorry, $1 million or more, assets of $1 million or more, and that they both agree to this type of relationship, that the buyers being represented and the sellers being represented by the same people in the office. So the mechanics in the office runs a little different. What has to happen here is the broker will be the dual agent, but it can't be dual agency. So in commercial, it's called designated sales associate. So let's take, for instance, that Cynthia is a specialist in gas stations. And Cynthia lists a gas station for sale. And she's out marketing the gas station, because typically you sell your own listing. So Cynthia gets a buyer that's interested in buying the gas station, but she knows she can't represent that person. So she comes to Honora, and Honora says, well, Cynthia, who do you want to represent? Do you want to represent your seller, or do you want to represent the buyer? And Cynthia says, well, you know, I started with the seller, so I'll just stay representing the seller. So then Honora will say, okay, Elizabeth, you represent the buyer. So the buyer and seller are still being represented inside the company, but by two different people. Now, these sales associates can't talk to one another about this transaction. And Honora has to stay neutral to each of you. She can't take one over the other. And then we can go ahead and close the transaction. Now, there's a little catch to this. Freck's happy. Right now, Freck's happy. Right? It's not dual agency. You got two different people. They're not talking to one another. It is in the same company, but it's commercial. We'll let that slide. But there is a little twist. This was Cynthia's seller and Cynthia's buyer. But now the buyer is being represented by Elizabeth. Who's getting paid? And how much?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's worked out. So Cynthia has to discuss with Honora. You may even suggest, I want Elizabeth to handle it. I've already spoken with Elizabeth. She'll accept X percent. I get X percent, and the deal is done.
So the broker doesn't say what the percentage would be?
Usually not.
Okay.
She likes her job.
Is it fair to split it, usually?
It's up to the discussion. How much work did you do? You know, did you get them to the point where all they have to do is sign the contract? Remember that you can't do anything anymore.
Okay.
She's going to have to take it through closing, go through the mortgage, get through the addendums, get through the due diligence period. You're out. So she's got a lot of work to do. So you have to understand that. You're going to have to come to that conclusion. Okay? But don't you dare think of doing that in residential, because it's dual agency in residential. All right? So only in commercial situations, or when it's outside of the residential definition.
Now that's the classroom part of it, but we don't do it. We've got somebody wants to buy a gas station or a hotel or commercial, we're referring that out to somebody
Yeah.
because we don't know anything about it.
We don't do commercial. It's very rare that we'll do a commercial transaction. We have done them.
And like this is considered commercial. So this is not, this building
Yeah.
is considered commercial.
Sure.
But
So
once
did
you
I do
get
the wrong
into
thing?
gas stations, hotels, and
I did the right thing, right? I was approached to sell a hair salon,
Okay?
and I said it wasn't within my sphere of
Okay, and what did you do with it?
Did you refer?
I told Albert Esposito,
And does he pay you a referral fee?
I don't know, does he?
Did we get a referral fee agreement?
No,
She didn't know she had to.
I just thought we didn't do commercial here,
You don't.
You're
We make
right.
a referral?
even commercial.
But we get a referral to
You wouldn't have
Esposito.
that without you.
So get with Honora after this time and send one over.
Yeah, we just send regular referral.
Send a referral over, and I'm sure he'll sign it, and, because he likes it.
Yeah, and he can do it.
I know.
And then you get your money.
And then you'll get a referral fee.
Yeah.
That's how we do it. Okay?
That's if he did something with it, right?
Well, if they close the transaction.
Yeah, he
If
didn't,
you-
then-
If there's no transaction closed, then there's no money to distribute. Right? Okay, so signature requirements, well, as I said, since there's the presumption of transaction brokerage, we don't have any disclosures at all. Except in our company, we require the transaction notice form, and that's in your outline as well. Okay? So when we establish something in writing, whether it's single agency or single agency or no brokerage relationship, we've got to have a contract in order to do that, right? So we have to have an agreement. We have to have an agreement. But in a transaction broker situation, there's no disclosure by law, but we require that the form be.
But the listing agreements to have it in it.
Yeah, the listing
You have to
agreement
choose the correct
is
one.
specific. The listing agreement has a single agency form. The listing agreement has a transaction broker form. And it also has no brokerage relationship form. So when you do a listing, it's already in your contracts.
Make sure you choose the right one.
Make sure you choose transaction brokerage. When you do the buyer brokerage agreement, that's the EBBA, Exclusive Buyer Broker Agreement, number 6, I think we're up to. They also have specific forms. So you would get EBBA 6 TB, Transaction Broker, and it's in that form as well.
That's the one Johnny gave us.
But if you're not getting a contract, which I think you should, you have to give them that transaction broker notice. Okay? All right, so how many years do we have to keep these records for? 5 years. So when you get involved in a contract, whether it's a listing agreement or it's a buyer-broker agreement, either one, we have to keep them for 5 years, regardless of whether they buy a property or we sell the property. Just because you had a contract, we have to keep those records for 5 years. Okay? Now, the appendix that you have, the rest of the pages in your outline, you'll see I've given you the single agency notice, consent to transition to transaction broker, and then you'll see the transaction broker duties form that I maintain and that we use in the company. Okay? So make sure you have plenty of those. So when you meet your buyer for the very first time, if you don't get involved in a contract with the buyer, you have to at least have this form filled out. Okay? Then you have the no brokerage relationship notice, which you'll use at the open houses or the one of 3 times that I've told you about. And each one of these forms, by the way, you see in your outline, these are generic forms, because when I teach this class to the masses, I show them the generic form. You have in your exit forms that I have given each one of you, the specific exit realty first choice transaction broker notice, or single agency. I've given you the exit forms that you can use. Okay? All right. Anybody got a question? All right, then we'll call it a day.